Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something that you might think you already know about, Muslim women and Ramadan.
Interesting.
But we're really going to go beyond the basics here
Yeah.
to kind of uncover how women really experience this holy month. And we've got some pretty interesting sources to help us with that. We've got a really in-depth article on Ramadan practices, a really cool personal story from a young woman named Sabrina,
Oh, nice.
and then some think pieces that really make you think
Yeah.
about the challenges and opportunities that Muslim women face during Ramadan.
I think what's really fascinating here is just how Ramadan is so often portrayed in just this monolithic kind of way.
Right.
And I think what's so great about a deep dive like this is that it really allows us to kind of explore these individual nuances. And, especially for women, I think that's something that's often overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's just kind of like unpack this a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, we know that Ramadan is the ninth month of the Islamic lunar calendar.
Right.
And it's a time for, fasting and prayer and spiritual reflection.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious about, are there any sort of like, specific things about the rules of fasting that address like women's experiences?
That's a really great question. And actually, there is. I think, a lot of people know that there are exceptions to fasting for people who physically can't.
Right.
But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that healthy adult women also have a really unique exemption,
Oh.
and that is during menstruation.
Oh, wow.
And so not only are they exempt from fasting during that time, but they're actually required to make up those fasts after Ramadan ends.
That's really interesting. It sounds like it's kind of like, like a system that's designed to be really like adaptable
Yeah.
to like the realities of women's lives.
Exactly. A lot of Islamic legal rulings really take into account the unique circumstances of women, and this is a prime example of that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I guess if like, the rules themselves are adaptable, I'm kind of wondering, how do individual women actually feel about navigating all this? Like, what kind of perspective do we get from Sabrina's story?
Well, Sabrina, who's 25, she actually finds working during Ramadan easier than being idle.
Really?
Yeah, she says it helps her manage her hunger and it kind of makes the time pass faster.
I can totally relate to that. Like when I'm busy, I'm less likely to like snack and stuff. So maybe I need to adopt like a Ramadan-inspired work ethic or
I
something.
love that. But I think her experience really highlights an interesting point, right? Like it's that sometimes the busyness of modern life can actually make that like physical act of fasting a little bit less demanding,
Yeah.
which can then free up that mental space for like a deeper spiritual reflection.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not just like about abstaining from the food and drink. It's really about pushing your like physical limits to enhance your spiritual awareness.
Precisely. Yeah. Fasting can really be seen as a way to kind of detach from those worldly desires and connect with something greater. It's something that you see in a lot of different spiritual traditions.
It makes you think, could like, restricting those physical needs actually unlock a deeper spiritual connection?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Absolutely. Now, our sources also touch on this idea that Ramadan is a time for like heightened domestic activity, especially for women.
Right.
So what does that look like in Sabrina's experience? What does that look like for her?
Well, Sabrina talks about how her mother prepares like traditional Ramadan dishes and regular meals,
Wow.
which seems like a lot to juggle.
Yeah, that is a lot. And you know what? The think piece actually brought up a really interesting kind of like tension here.
Yeah.
Some feminists and Muslim commentators criticized that emphasis on the cooking, seeing it as like, perpetuating those traditional gender roles and just placing like, an unfair burden on women. Do you think that criticism is fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a valid concern, especially in, a more modern context where women are increasingly taking on roles outside of the home.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to consider this kind of counterpoint, and that is that for a lot of families, these shared meals and the time spent together in the kitchen are actually really cherished traditions
Oh, yeah.
that deepen their sense of community and their spirituality.
That's a good point. Yeah. Maybe it's not really about labeling those activities as lost time or like productive time, but just recognizing that meaning can be found in different ways for different people.
Totally. And Sabrina's account actually gives us a really beautiful illustration of that. For her family, that time spent in the kitchen becomes a time for reflection, for prayer, or like meaningful conversations.
Yeah.
It's kind of like flipping the script on what we assume is happening in that domestic space, right?
Right. So is it possible that what we're seeing as like lost time is actually like an opportunity for connection and a different kind of engagement?
I think it's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
And it really challenges that idea that there's only one right way to experience Ramadan, especially for women.
It's amazing how, like, hearing those personal stories
Yeah,
really challenges our assumptions about these practices.
absolutely.
It really makes you realize how much depth there is
Yeah.
to something like Ramadan.
For sure. And speaking of assumptions, one of our sources brings up a pretty sensitive topic, actually. This whole idea of how Muslim women are portrayed during Ramadan.
Oh, you mean that opinion piece?
Yes.
With that super provocative title?
Yeah, exactly.
The one that talked about the Bonish and tradable image?
Yes, that one?
I'll admit, I had to look that one up. I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure what that meant.
Yeah, so it basically translates to, like, the uncompromising housewife.
Oh.
And the author's arguing that some portrayals, especially like in certain feminist circles, but even, within some Muslim circles too, they focus so much on the domestic side of things.
Yeah.
That it ends up painting this picture of Muslim women, being like solely defined by their role in the kitchen.
Which is interesting because that seems to contradict the whole, feminist critique about spending too much time in the kitchen.
Exactly.
Like they can't win.
It's a double bind for sure.
Yeah, either they're like neglecting their spiritual duties,
Right.
or they're like perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
Yeah, that's exactly the point the author is making.
Yeah.
This piece really challenges the idea that time in the kitchen equals lost time.
Right.
What if, they say, what if it's a time for reflection, for prayer, for having those meaningful conversations with family?
Right. Like we saw with Sabrina, right?
Exactly.
Like it could be meaningful.
It's about recognizing that what might seem like a chore to one person could be a deeply meaningful practice for someone else.
For sure. And it goes even further, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the author even questions why we assume that time spent, like, on phone calls or
Right.
shopping is somehow more valuable
Right.
than the time spent nourishing your family.
Totally. Totally. It flips the script on how we define productive time.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. The author points out, the irony
Yeah.
of telling Muslim women what they should be doing with their time during Ramadan,
Yes.
while also criticizing them for focusing on domestic tasks.
Yes. A total double standard.
Yeah, it is.
It really highlights that tension between advocating for women's choices, but then also kind of, imposing this different set of expectations on them at the same time.
Right, right.
So it begs the question, are we really empowering women by dictating how they should experience their faith, even if it's coming from a good place?
I think that's a really crucial point. Like, it seems like the takeaway here is just the importance of respecting individual choices, right?
Yes.
And recognizing that there's no single right way to experience Ramadan.
Especially for women, yeah.
Especially for women, yeah.
And that goes back to, one of the core tenets of Ramadan, right?
Mm.
Self-discipline and reflection. And maybe this month is an invitation for all of us, regardless of gender, to examine our own biases and assumptions about how other people practice their faith.
I love that. That's really good. It reminds us to move beyond these generalizations.
Absolutely.
And appreciate all the different ways that Muslim women are navigating their faith
For sure.
during this time.
And, speaking of navigating faith, remember those rulings we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah, the unique ones.
Like the exemption from fasting during menstruation?
Right.
The texts we were looking at, both the article and the think piece, they highlight the reasoning behind this.
Oh, okay.
They emphasize that it's about recognizing those physical and emotional challenges
Yeah.
that women face during that time.
Right. It's like Islamic law really tries to
Yeah.
accommodate those individual circumstances.
Be adaptable, for sure.
Yeah. But it also raises this question, about how these rulings might be perceived today.
Right, in a modern context.
Yes. And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
That think piece, it actually explores some of the criticism
Yeah.
that's directed at this exemption.
Right.
With some people arguing that it reinforces this idea that women are somehow impure during menstruation.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue. On one hand, you have the religious justification,
Right.
which is rooted in centuries of tradition and interpretation, right?
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have contemporary perspectives that might view this ruling as being outdated or even discriminatory.
It's a tough one.
It is, and that's where critical thinking comes in, right?
Yeah.
As informed listeners, it's up to us to engage with these different viewpoints,
Yeah.
understand the historical and cultural context,
Right.
and then, form our own conclusion.
Right. It's not about just blindly accepting or rejecting anything, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that knowledge isn't just about absorbing information.
Yeah.
It's about grappling with its complexities
Right.
and acknowledging that there might not be any easy answers.
Yeah, for sure. And the think piece also brings up this idea that even when women are exempt from fasting, there are still ways to be spiritually engaged, right?
Oh, absolutely. They mention things like listening to Quran recitations,
Oh, yeah.
engaging in dhikr, making supplications, even contributing to charitable acts, like helping to prepare the iftar meal.
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with dhikr. Could you explain that a little bit?
Of course. So, dhikr is basically the practice of remembering God,
Okay.
often through the repetition of specific phrases or prayers.
Oh, I see.
It's a way of keeping that spirit of Ramadan alive, even when you're not physically fasting.
Okay, that's beautiful. So even with these limitations or challenges, there are always ways to nurture that connection, right?
Exactly. And maybe that's a lesson we can all take with us beyond Ramadan, right?
Yeah?
Finding ways to stay connected to what matters most, even when circumstances make it difficult to follow that traditional path.
It's like finding workarounds in our spiritual lives.
I like that. And speaking of finding ways to connect, Sabrina's story highlights another really important part of Ramadan,
Okay?
the celebration and the joy that comes with all this discipline and self-restraint.
Oh, yeah, that's right. She talked about her family getting together for iftar,
Yes.
sharing meals, and just enjoying each other's company.
Exactly. It reminds us that Ramadan isn't just about individual practice,
Right.
but it's about creating this sense of belonging and connection within a community.
Totally, totally.
It's a reminder that faith can be a source of joy and comfort and support,
Yeah.
especially during challenging times.
And, speaking of challenges, I remember one of the sources kind of dug into this whole concern about the portrayal of Muslim women during Ramadan.
Right.
This idea that they're constantly being told what to do, how to be,
Yes, you're talking about that opinion piece again, right?
yeah, the Bonish intradable one.
Exactly.
The phrase stuck with me.
I know, right? It's very evocative.
It is.
But yeah, the author argues that Muslim women face criticism both from secular feminists
Right.
and from some within the Muslim community itself.
Right. It's like they're getting it from both sides.
Totally a double bind. On
Yeah.
one hand, they're criticized for adhering to those traditional roles.
Right.
But then on the other hand, they're told they should be focusing on, more spiritual activities.
It's a no-win situation, it sounds like.
It really is. And the author really highlights the irony of these expectations, right? Suggesting that ultimately it's about allowing women the freedom to choose how they want to experience Ramadan.
So that choice might involve embracing those traditional roles.
Right.
Or it might mean, finding a different path
Yeah.
that aligns with their personal values.
Totally. The key is respecting that autonomy.
Right, I agree. And the author makes another important point. It's not about labeling certain activities as lost time or productive time.
Right.
It's about recognizing that each individual's journey is unique, right?
Right.
And fulfillment can be found in so many different ways.
For sure.
Maybe the real lost time is the time that we spend, judging other people's choices
Oh, I like that.
instead of focusing on our own spiritual growth.
That's deep.
And I think that leads perfectly into this final and I think most critical point that all of our sources raise. Ramadan as a transformative experience.
Yes.
This journey of self-discovery
Absolutely.
and spiritual awakening.
It's about so much more than just the rituals, right?
Right, exactly. Like Sadina described it as this time of purification.
Yes, a chance to reset and reconnect.
Yeah, and that article talked about, the practices associated with Ramadan
Right.
and how they're all about cultivating those virtues like patience, gratitude, compassion.
For sure. Even the opinion piece, despite focusing on all those challenges and controversies, it still emphasized that search for balance, right?
Right.
That allows for spiritual growth and personal fulfillment.
It's fascinating how they all kind of come back to that, right?
I know.
This theme of transformation.
Yeah, it's not just about the rituals or the restrictions. It's about something deeper.
Right, interchange.
Yeah, and you know what? This transformation isn't limited to just Ramadan itself.
Right.
It's about carrying those lessons, those virtues, into the rest of our lives,
Yeah.
making them a part of who we are, not just what we do for a month.
That's a beautiful thought.
It is.
To think of it as this like catalyst
Yeah,
for positive change.
absolutely.
A springboard for a more mindful
Yes.
and compassionate life.
I think that's the real takeaway from this deep dive,
Yeah.
the realization that Ramadan at its core is about so much more than meets the eye.
Right.
It's an invitation to look inward, to challenge our assumptions, to grow in empathy and understanding.
That's such a powerful message.
It is.
And it really resonates no matter what your background is.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's worth just pausing and reflecting on that question that's been at the heart of this whole exploration, right?
Okay.
What does it really mean for experience Ramadan, especially for women?
Yeah. It's a question that makes us think beyond those easy answers.
For sure.
acknowledge the nuances,
Yes.
the
The
complexities,
struggles, the
the different
triumphs,
perspectives
all of
that
it.
shaped this journey for millions of women all over the world.
Yeah. And maybe that's the true value of a deep dive like this.
Yeah,
Prompting us to ask those tough questions, challenge our preconceived notions, and embrace that richness and diversity of human experience.
even within a shared faith,
Exactly.
right? It's a reminder that pursuing knowledge isn't about finding all the answers.
Right.
It's about that continuous process of learning, questioning, and expanding our understanding.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, how this deep dive has really kind of like revealed both the personal and the societal layers of Ramadan, especially for women.
Mm.
I mean, we talked about like adaptability, individual experiences, even challenging stereotypes. But I feel like there's still this big question that's just kind of hanging out there.
Yeah.
Like, is Ramadan ultimately empowering or restrictive for women?
I mean, that is the question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer,
Yeah.
but I do think, maybe if we kind of dig into some of the controversies and criticisms,
Okay.
we might get a little bit closer to understanding it all.
Yeah, okay, I like that. So one of the things that we keep coming back to is this whole emphasis on like the cooking
Right.
and the domestic duties during Ramadan.
Yeah.
Some people argue it reinforces those traditional gender roles,
Yeah.
while others see it as, this valuable expression of their faith and their family.
Right.
Where do you kind of like land on all of this?
It's tricky, because like on the surface, it does seem like women are shouldering like a heavier load.
Yeah,
I mean, even our think piece questioned like whether that extra work limits their opportunities for spiritual growth.
right.
But then we have Sabrina's experience where those domestic activities actually become these moments of like connection and reflection.
Yeah, it's almost like the intention and the individual's perspective really matters.
Totally, totally.
It makes you wonder if sometimes the criticism is coming from like trying to force a modern Western lens onto this practice
Right.
that's rooted in like centuries of tradition.
Exactly.
You can't just like take out one piece
Yeah.
without understanding the whole picture, right?
You got to look at the whole context.
Exactly.
It's about understanding that cultural context, right? Just like we wouldn't judge another culture's customs without, considering their history and values.
Right.
We need to approach this aspect of Ramadan with the same kind of nuance.
Okay, I like that. Another point of contention that came up in our sources was this whole idea that some Islamic rulings kind of restrict women's activities more than men's,
Yeah,
especially during Ramadan.
right.
Specifically, like the guidelines around prayer
Uh-huh.
and physical touch during menstruation.
Yeah, this really gets to the heart of how those religious texts are interpreted and applied. Like some people view those rulings as being super outdated,
Yeah,
but others see them as like essential to maintaining spiritual purity.
right.
It's important to remember that within any faith, there's going to be a whole range of beliefs and practices.
That's true. So how do we reconcile these seemingly conflicting viewpoints?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right? Like, is there a way to honor tradition while also acknowledging that, interpretations need to evolve?
I think open dialogue is key.
Yeah.
Like what we're doing right now, just talking about it.
Right.
By respectfully discussing those different perspectives,
Yeah.
we can learn from each other.
Right.
And maybe even find some common ground.
Yeah.
Because shutting down conversation only leads to more division.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's super important to make sure we're including Muslim women's voices
Yes, absolutely.
in this conversation.
Considering their experiences, for sure.
Yeah, because those lived experiences are like the most valuable source of knowledge here.
One hit.
I mean, Sabrina's story, for instance, gave us such rich insights into how this all actually plays out in real life.
Yeah, totally.
And that opinion piece, while it was critical of certain portrayals, it also offers some really valuable perspectives from, within the Muslim community.
For sure. It all goes back to challenging that, what was it?
The Bonish and tradable,
Yes, that's the one.
that image, right?
Yeah.
We can't let those stereotypes kind of like dominate our understanding of
Mm-hmm.
such a diverse group of women.
Absolutely. And that's where that critical thinking comes in, right? Like,
Yeah.
as we've been exploring these sources, we've seen those contrasting viewpoints, the historical context, those personal interpretations.
Right.
And ultimately, it's up to each of us to kind of weigh the evidence and come to our own conclusions.
So after all of this, like, where do we even land on that question of empowerment versus restriction?
Ooh, if I had to like boil it down to one thing, I'd say Ramadan, like any faith-based practice,
Yeah.
has the potential to be both to remede it.
Okay.
It really depends on the individual, their community, and their own understanding of their faith.
Right. So it's like it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all experience.
And that's kind of beautiful in a way, right?
It
Like
is.
Ramadan offers this chance for reflection, growth, and connection.
Yeah,
But ultimately, it's up to each individual to define what that experience means for them.
I love that. What a powerful thought to leave our listeners with.
Yeah, I think so too. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope everyone listening takes away from all of this?
I just hope this conversation has inspired people to kind of look beyond those surface level understandings of Ramadan, especially when it comes to women's experiences.
Yeah.
There's just like so much depth and complexity and beauty to uncover when we engage with different perspectives and challenge our own assumptions.
I agree, totally. And who knows?
Yeah,
Maybe this deep dive will spark some curiosity
I hope so.
to learn even more
Yeah.
about Muslim women's lives.
Yes, not just during Ramadan, but all year round.
Exactly.
Because ultimately, the pursuit of knowledge is an ongoing journey,
Yeah.
and there's always more to learn.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
This was great.
All right, everyone, we'll see you next time.
56.